Here comes the family parasite. My dad scoffed at me in front of the whole room. At a luxury gala, my brother snapped, "I wish you had never been my sister." My mother turned her eyes away. Then the CEO stepped up. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Forbes-honored founder and billionaire who built this bank, Amelia." That was the very moment my family finally realized the truth had arrived in the most unexpected way. Have you ever been so utterly dismissed, so completely erased, that it felt like you didn't even exist to your own family? Well, mine didn't just dismiss me in private. They did it in front of 300 strangers, at a luxury gala, just moments before the biggest, most shocking surprise of their lives. Can you even imagine the look on their faces when my own father, at a fancy gala, leaned into a microphone, smirked, and sneered, "Here comes the family beggar"? And then, just moments later, that same microphone was announcing me as the guest of honor? The room went quiet, and that was when my family realized the story they believed about me was about to absolutely shatter. The laughter died, not all at once, but in choking fragments. People caught themselves mid-breath, unsure if they should continue this polite charade or just retreat into utter, bewildered confusion. I watched their faces contort, a slow, dawning horror. Heads swiveled, first to the stage, then to me, then back to my father, who still clung to that microphone like a lifeline, utterly oblivious that his entire narrative, the one he'd so carefully crafted for decades, was about to just disintegrate. The chandeliers above us, dripping with crystal, seemed to dim, but I knew it was just my perception narrowing, focusing entirely on the silence that was now spreading like a cold fog through the grand ballroom. 300 guests, maybe more, all dressed in their finest gowns and tailored suits, suddenly realized that something fundamental had shifted. The clink of champagne glasses stopped. The murmur of polite conversation evaporated into nothing. What remained was this collective, suffocating holding of breath. I'd felt this before, you know. Not this exact, surreal moment, but the sensation beneath it. That familiar, crushing weight of being looked at without being truly seen. The instinct to shrink, to disappear, to let the attention pass over me like bad weather. For 32 years, I had perfected the art of surviving moments just like this. But I never, ever expected one to arrive so publicly, so dramatically. My father's joke? The family beggar? Oh, that wasn't new. Not at all. He'd called me worse, in the supposed privacy of our home, in the casual cruelty of family dinners, in those offhand remarks that everyone else pretended not to hear. It was his weapon, his way of reducing me to something manageable, something that didn't threaten his very rigid understanding of who mattered and who simply didn't. I had grown up believing that label was mine to carry, that it was simply the truth of who I was in the rigid hierarchy he had built. But standing there in that opulent ballroom, wearing a dress I'd chosen for its simple elegance rather than its price tag, I finally understood something profound. That cruel label, it no longer fit. Not because I had suddenly changed, but because the world around me had finally caught up to who I had always been, underneath all their projections. My brother, Daniel, was standing near the bar, a drink halfway to his lips, frozen in a posture of casual disdain that now looked utterly ridiculous, completely out of sync with the electrifying tension of the room. He'd always been so comfortable in his role as the favored son, the golden boy whose failures were conveniently forgotten and whose smallest successes were amplified 100-fold. He didn't know how to exist in a space where his privileged position was suddenly, undeniably uncertain. And my mother, she remained exactly where she'd been all evening, a little behind my father, a little to the side, occupying the exact amount of space she had always allowed herself. She had this incredible, almost pathological gift for disappearing into her own presence, for being there without ever really being noticed, for masterfully avoiding any confrontation that just might have, protected me. I didn't blame her anymore, not really. I had stopped expecting her to choose me decades ago. The CEO, a man named Richard Chun, who had built his formidable reputation on precision and quiet discretion, stood waiting at the podium. He had the kind of patience that comes from truly understanding perfect timing. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded attention. He had simply spoken just a few words, and the entire room had responded, a collective gasp. I knew exactly what he was about to say. I'd known for months that this moment might come, though I had never actively sought it. I hadn't planned for my family to be in this room when the truth finally emerged. I hadn't orchestrated any grand confrontation. I had simply lived my life, made my choices, and quietly built something that belonged entirely to me. And tonight, by some strange coincidence, or perhaps a twist of fate, those two parallel paths had finally, irrevocably, crossed right around me. I could see the subtle recalibrations happening in real time. A woman in emerald silk, who'd ignored me earlier, now looked at me with a sudden, intense interest. A man who'd been asking my father about his golf game was now studying me with the careful, calculating attention of someone reassessing a major investment. The very social architecture of the room was visibly shifting, and I was no longer standing on the periphery. I was right at its new, trembling foundation. What surprised me most, honestly, was how little I actually felt. I had imagined this moment in countless different forms over the years. I had fantasized about the day my family would be forced to see me differently, and I had expected satisfaction, vindication, maybe even pure, unadulterated joy. Instead, there was just this strange, profound calm, a recognition that this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about reality, finally, gloriously aligning with the truth. My father slowly, almost robotically, lowered the microphone. His expression transitioned from utter confusion into something harder, something that looked almost like genuine fear. He was a man who had always controlled the story of our family, who had decided who was worthy and who was not, who had built his entire identity on being the voice that others unquestioningly followed. He simply did not know how to exist in a story where he was no longer the author. The CEO cleared his throat. The room, every single person in it, leaned in. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that everything that had come before this exact moment had been a preparation. The years of forced silence, the accumulated dismissals, the slow, patient building of something entirely outside their narrow understanding. It had all led right here, to this ballroom, to this suspended breath before the final, undeniable revelation. I looked at Richard Chun, and something passed between us that needed no words. He understood what this moment meant for me, and I understood what it meant for him to be the one delivering it. We had worked together for years, built something incredible, trusted each other through decisions that had shaped both our futures. He wasn't doing this for drama. He was doing this because it was simply, unequivocally, the truth. The room waited, my family waited, and I waited too, though not for vindication anymore. I waited for the moment when the story I had been told about myself would finally lose all its power, when the words my father had used to define me, to diminish me, would finally dissolve into utter irrelevance. Richard Chin began to speak again, and for the first time in what felt like years, I let myself feel something that might have been hope. That moment, that electrifying suspension in the ballroom, it stayed suspended in my mind long after the guests had gone. But it wasn't the revelation itself that I kept returning to, not really. It was the chilling familiarity of what had come just before it. The practiced ease with which my father had wielded his mockery, the way my brother had added his cold, casual agreement without even a flicker of hesitation. They hadn't even needed to think about it. Dismissing me was as natural to them as breathing. I had spent my entire childhood learning to recognize the precise shape of my own absence. Not a physical absence, mind you. I was always present at the dinner table, always included in those perfect, posed family photographs that lined the hallway of our sprawling Connecticut home. But there was another kind of absence, the kind that exists when people look through you instead of at you. When your voice is heard but not truly listened to. When your presence is acknowledged, sure, but never, ever truly valued. My father never hurt me physically. He never even raised his voice in genuine anger. His weapon was something far more refined, far more insidious. He used words the way other men used fists, delivering blows that left no visible marks, but accumulated over years into something so heavy, so permanent, that it felt like it was etched into my very soul. The family beggar. The afterthought. The one who would always need to be carried. I remember the first time I truly understood that I occupied a fundamentally different position than my brother. I was 8 years old. Daniel was 12. Our father had taken us both to his office downtown. It was a Saturday, so the building was mostly empty, but he wanted to show us where he worked, to give us a sense of what he did and, more importantly, why it mattered. He walked Daniel through every single room, explained every function, introduced him to the few colleagues who were there. He talked about legacy and responsibility, about the importance of understanding how money moves and why. Daniel listened, his face serious, attentive, like a boy who understood he was being groomed, being prepared for something grand. I followed behind them, utterly unaddressed, completely unacknowledged. When we reached my father's impressive corner office, he sat Daniel in his plush leather chair and took a photograph. I stood by the door, just waiting to be included. That photograph, it was later framed and placed prominently on his desk. I wasn't in it. These weren't dramatic moments of overt cruelty, you know. They were small, almost imperceptible exclusions that accumulated into a pattern so utterly consistent that it became invisible to everyone. Everyone except me. My father didn't hate me. He simply didn't consider me relevant to the story he was meticulously building. The story of a successful man passing his achievements to his son. My mother existed in the spaces between these moments, a presence that was always nearby, but never, ever truly protective. She had her own unique way of surviving my father's household, a strategy of strategic invisibility that kept her safe from his sharper edges. She loved me, I truly believe, in the way she was capable of loving. But she had made her choice long before I was old enough to even comprehend it. She had chosen peace over justice, comfort over confrontation. When I did well in school, she would smile and tell me she was proud, but the words always felt rehearsed, detached from any genuine engagement with my actual achievements. When I won the state math competition in 10th grade, she mentioned it at dinner as if she were reporting the weather forecast. My father just nodded, not even looking up from his plate. Daniel, ever the charmer, asked if there was any money involved, and when I said no, the conversation immediately moved on. I learned, slowly but surely, to stop expecting recognition. And more importantly, I learned to stop needing it. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes from accepting that the people who should celebrate you never will. It's a cold and lonely freedom, yes, but freedom nonetheless. I began to build my sense of worth from different materials. From the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, of a challenge met. From the profound knowledge that my competence was real, even if it remained completely unseen by them. Daniel, meanwhile, grew into exactly the role our father had so carefully designed for him. He was confident in that particular way that comes from never having been seriously doubted. Charming in that way that comes from always having been effusively praised. His failures were treated as learning experiences. His mistakes, necessary steps in his development. When he crashed our father's expensive car at 17, it became a funny anecdote at family gatherings. When I got AB in chemistry the same year, my father asked if I was applying myself. The disparity was so utterly consistent that it stopped feeling like an injustice and started to feel like a natural law. Daniel was the sun, and I was just something that existed in his vast shadow, not by choice, but by the relentless gravitational pull of my father's unwavering attention. I don't think Daniel was inherently cruel, not by nature. He simply absorbed the hierarchy he was born into, and never once questioned whether it was fair. My mother's silence, though, that was the hardest part. She saw everything. She understood everything. And she chose to do nothing. She would sometimes catch my eye after one of my father's barbed remarks, and I would see something there, a flicker of recognition, maybe even a tiny spark of sympathy. But she never spoke up, never intervened, never pulled me aside to tell me that what was happening was wrong. I used to wonder if she was afraid of him. Later, I understood that her silence wasn't about fear, it was about cold, hard calculation. She had weighed the cost of defending me against the cost of maintaining her own comfortable position, and she had made her choice. I was not worth the disruption. By the time I left for college, I had already begun the painstaking process of building a separate life. A life where my value was not, and could not, be determined by my father's dismissive assessments. I chose economics, not because it was my burning passion, but because it was intensely practical. Because it gave me tools that could directly translate into something I desperately craved, independence. I worked while I studied, managed my own finances, made my own decisions, all without seeking approval from people who had never genuinely offered it. I didn't announce the separation. I didn't declare my independence in some dramatic confrontation. I simply stopped participating in the fiction that I belonged to them in any meaningful way. I showed up for holidays because, honestly, it was easier than explaining my absence. I smiled through the dinners where Daniel's latest, often dubious, accomplishments were celebrated, and mine were glossed over in a few polite, dismissive sentences. And then I returned to the life I was building in the spaces they could not see, the world they could not comprehend. The role they had given me was the role of someone who did not matter. I accepted it for years because I simply didn't know there was another option. But acceptance, you see, is not the same thing as belief. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of my quiet compliance, I was already becoming someone else entirely. The decision came quietly, the way most truly important decisions do. There was no dramatic lightning bolt of realization, no heated confrontation that finally forced my hand. I simply woke up one morning during my junior year of college and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was done waiting to be seen by people who had absolutely no interest in looking. I was 20 years old, living in a small apartment near campus that I paid for with a combination of scholarships and part-time jobs. My roommate was a quiet girl from Ohio, studying nursing, and we had developed a comfortable rhythm of coexistence that suited both of us just fine. The apartment was nothing special, I'll admit, but it was mine. Earned through my own efforts, uncontaminated by my family's opinions or expectations. That morning, I sat at my tiny kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a spreadsheet open on my laptop, tracking my expenses and income for the month. I had been doing this since I was 18, not out of dire necessity, but out of a deep, almost compulsive desire to understand exactly where I stood, to know precisely what I had and what I needed. It was a habit that would serve me well in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine back then. And as I looked at those numbers, it hit me. I had spent years orienting my entire life around a question that no longer mattered. The question had always been, how do I prove to them that I am worth something? But sitting there in that small kitchen, surrounded by my own quiet efforts, I finally understood that the question itself was flawed. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I needed to build something for myself, something that existed completely independent of their approval, their recognition, or their utter lack thereof. It wasn't a dramatic, overnight transformation, you know. I didn't suddenly become confident or fearless. I simply shifted my focus. I redirected my energy from desperately seeking validation to quietly, methodically, creating actual value. The difference was subtle, yes, but so profound, like changing the angle of a lens and suddenly seeing a completely different picture, a whole new world. I chose finance because, quite simply, I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me in a way that human relationships often did not. There was a purity to mathematics, a reliability that I found profoundly comforting. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't play favorites. They didn't pretend to see you while looking right through you. They simply were what they were, and if you understood them well enough, they would tell you the unvarnished truth. I studied relentlessly, not to impress anyone, but because I genuinely, truly wanted to understand. I devoured textbooks and case studies, analyzed market trends, taught myself the intricate fundamentals of investment analysis and risk assessment. My professors noticed my dedication, though I never sought their attention. And slowly, several of them began to mentor me informally, opening doors I hadn't even known existed. My first internship was at a small investment firm in Hartford, the kind of place that didn't recruit at prestigious Ivy League schools, but instead took chances on students who showed real, raw promise. I was assigned to the research department, where my job was to compile data and generate reports that, honestly, no one expected to be particularly good. But I took the work seriously, applied the same rigor and meticulousness I had developed in my studies, and within a few months, my reports were being read by senior analysts who had, initially, completely ignored me. It was there that I learned perhaps the most important lesson of my early career. Competence, consistently demonstrated, eventually becomes utterly impossible to ignore. I didn't network aggressively. I didn't chase promotions. I simply did excellent work, day after day, week after week, and let the results speak for themselves. The firm offered me a full-time position after graduation, and I took it. even though it meant staying in Hartford when most of my classmates were flocking to New York or Boston for more prestigious opportunities. But I understood something they didn't. Prestige was borrowed power, something that could be given and taken away by others at a whim. What I wanted was owned power, the kind that came from building something myself, from the ground up. My family, of course, knew absolutely nothing of this. I hadn't told them about the internship, the job offer, the quiet, meaningful work I was doing. When they occasionally asked about my plans, I gave vague answers about exploring options, letting them conveniently assume whatever they wanted. My father probably assumed I was struggling. My mother probably assumed I would eventually just come home and find something modest to occupy my time. And Daniel probably didn't think about me at all. And that was fine. I discovered my talent for speaking almost by accident. The firm needed someone to present our quarterly research to clients, and the senior analyst who usually handled it was, conveniently, sick. They asked me to fill in, more out of sheer desperation than any real confidence in my abilities. And I agreed, because saying no had never truly been my strategy. I prepared meticulously, practiced until I knew every single word, every transition, every possible question that could be thrown at me. And when I stood in front of those clients, something shifted. The nervousness I expected simply didn't materialize. Instead, I felt this strange, profound calm, a sense that I knew exactly what I was talking about and exactly how to communicate it. The years of silence in my family had, ironically, taught me to choose my words carefully, to speak only when I truly had something worth saying. That discipline translated into a powerful presence that people couldn't help but notice. After the presentation, one of the clients approached me and asked how long I'd been in the industry. When I told him, less than 2 years, he just handed me his business card and said, "Call me if you ever want to discuss opportunities." I didn't call him immediately, but I kept the card, a quiet understanding dawning that doors were, finally, beginning to open. Over the next few years, I moved through positions with a deliberate, almost surgical purpose. Each step was chosen not for superficial prestige, but for deep, meaningful learning. I worked at a regional bank, then a consulting firm, then a cutting-edge startup that was trying to disrupt traditional investment models. Each role taught me something new, expanded my understanding of how money moved, and, more importantly, why people made the decisions they did. I even started hosting financial seminars, small events at first, then larger and larger ones as my reputation quietly grew. I wasn't a charismatic speaker in the traditional sense, but I had something that audiences profoundly responded to: clarity. I could take complex concepts and make them utterly understandable, cut through all the jargon and confusion to deliver insights that people could actually use. My family, remarkably, remained completely oblivious. I attended holidays when I absolutely couldn't avoid them, smiled through dinners where Daniel's latest, often vague, venture was discussed in painstaking detail, while my entire life was glossed over in a few polite, meaningless sentences. I no longer minded. Their ignorance wasn't a wound anymore. It was just a fact, like the weather, or the relentless passage of time. I was building something they couldn't see, in a world they didn't understand. And for the first time in my life, I was genuinely, profoundly happy. Daniel had always been the future our family was building toward. I understood this from an age too young to articulate it, absorbing it through the thousand small, unspoken moments that communicated without words, whose dreams truly mattered and whose did not. He was 4 years older than me, which in childhood feels like an entire generation. By the time I was forming my earliest memories, he was already firmly established as the undeniable center of our father's attention, the sole recipient of lessons and opportunities that I would only ever learn about secondhand. I don't remember resenting this arrangement at first. It simply was, like gravity, or the color of the sky, a fundamental, unchangeable feature of the world I had been born into. Our father wasn't a cruel man in the obvious, dramatic ways. He provided for us generously, ensured we had good schools and comfortable lives, and showed up for the big occasions that absolutely required his presence. But his attention, that was a finite resource, and he had allocated it entirely to Daniel, leaving absolutely nothing for me except the occasional glance of mild disappointment, as if my very existence was a first draft he hadn't quite gotten around to editing. Daniel absorbed this attention the way a plant absorbs sunlight, growing relentlessly toward it, shaping himself entirely around it. He wasn't naturally brilliant, I would realize much later, but he had been told so often that he was exceptional that he had come to believe it implicitly. And belief, in certain circumstances, can be a kind of self-fulfilling truth. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never, ever having been seriously doubted. He spoke with the authority of someone who fully expected to be listened to, always. Our Father's plan for him was never stated explicitly, but it was always understood. Daniel would learn the family business. He would take over when our father was finally ready to step back, and he would carry the family name into the next generation with all the success it deserved. Every conversation, every opportunity, every introduction was meticulously oriented toward this preordained future. I watched from the periphery as Daniel was prepared for a life of boundless significance. He was taken to board meetings while I was still in elementary school, introduced to our father's colleagues as the next generation. His grades, which were mediocre at best, were effortlessly explained away as the result of his being too creative for traditional academics. His failures were miraculously reframed as bold experiments, his mistakes as necessary education. When Daniel dropped out of his first semester of business school, our father simply called it a strategic pivot. When he then spent 2 years traveling through Europe on our family's money, it was grandly described as broadening his perspective. And when he finally returned and announced he wanted to start his own company, our father provided the capital without a moment's hesitation, without any due diligence, without the slightest skepticism he would have applied to literally any other investment. The company was a tech startup of some kind, vague in its actual purpose, yet wildly ambitious in its promises. Daniel would talk endlessly about disruption and innovation, using words he'd clearly learned from glossy magazine articles and polished TED Talks, and our father would nod along as if he understood every syllable and enthusiastically approved. The business model never quite made sense to me, even from my disadvantage point, but I was never asked for my opinion, so I never offered it. I had learned by then that my assessments were simply not welcome in family discussions. The few times I had dared to offer observations about Daniel's ventures, I had been met with the kind of silence that communicates far more than words ever could. My father would look at me with something like pity, as if my concerns revealed my own inherent limitations rather than any actual problems with Daniel's grand plans. My mother would instantly change the subject. Daniel would just smile, that smug, knowing smile of someone who knew he was perfectly, utterly protected. So, I stopped offering observations. I just attended the family dinners where Daniel's supposed progress was celebrated, listened to the wildly optimistic reports that conveniently glossed over all the glaring warning signs, and kept my thoughts strictly to myself. It's not my business, I told myself. It's not my money being risked. It's not my future being gambled on promises that grew more extravagant with each telling. But I watched. Oh, I couldn't help but watch. The way you can't help watching a car that's slowly, inevitably, drifting toward the edge of the road. I saw the patterns that our father stubbornly refused to see, the glaring inconsistencies in Daniel's stories, the way his explanations became increasingly elaborate as the actual results became more and more difficult to explain. The startup burned through its initial funding in 18 short months. Daniel, predictably, returned to our father for more, and more was provided. The second round lasted barely a year. I understood what this meant, even if my parents stubbornly refused to. Daniel had built nothing, proven nothing, learned nothing, except that his failures would always be cushioned by endless family money and impenetrable family denial. He had been given every single advantage and had squandered them all, not through bad luck, but through the fundamental, crippling lack of discipline that comes from never, ever facing real consequences. Our father continued to defend him, continued to explain away the failures as merely the cost of innovation. He stubbornly continued to believe in a future that grew more fictional, more fantastical, with each passing year. I think he needed to believe it, you know. He needed Daniel to succeed because Daniel's success was, in his mind, his own success, his own validation, his own proof that his choices had been undeniably right. Watching this entire charade unfold taught me something incredibly valuable about the true nature of privilege. It wasn't just about money or opportunity, though those certainly mattered. It was about the stories people told themselves, the narratives they meticulously constructed to make sense of their choices and justify their actions. Our father had decided that Daniel was the future, and he would interpret every single piece of evidence through that narrow, biased lens, no matter how much cold, hard reality contradicted his conclusions. I was not part of that narrative. I existed completely outside it, looking in and seeing clearly what those trapped inside simply could not. And I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that the lavish stage being built for Daniel would not hold his weight forever. No one invited me to the opportunity that truly changed my trajectory. I found it myself, recognized it for what it was, and simply walked through the door before anyone could tell me I didn't belong there. I was 28 years old, working at a mid-sized investment firm in Boston, doing work that was competent, yes, but not exceptional. Building a reputation that was solid, but not particularly remarkable. I had been there for 3 years, long enough to understand the firm's patterns and limitations, long enough to see that advancement would be painfully slow and dependent on factors entirely beyond my control. The opportunity appeared in the unassuming form of a distressed asset portfolio that absolutely no one else wanted to touch. A small regional bank was failing, its loan book a complete mess of bad decisions, and even worse timing. Our firm had been approached about potentially acquiring some of its holdings. The senior partners looked at the numbers and saw only glaring risk, immense liability, and potential embarrassment. They passed emphatically. But I looked at the exact same numbers and saw something entirely different. I saw patterns beneath the chaos. Assets that had been mismanaged, yes, but were not inherently worthless. Opportunities buried under thick layers of incompetence and neglect. I spent 3 weeks, entirely on my own time, without telling a single soul, meticulously analyzing that portfolio in excruciating detail. Building models, identifying the pieces that could be salvaged, and just as importantly, the pieces that absolutely should be abandoned. When I finally brought my analysis to my supervisor, he listened with the polite, weary attention of someone who fully expected to be disappointed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long, heavy moment, looking at my spreadsheets with an expression I couldn't quite read. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I was as sure as analysis could make me, which wasn't the same as absolutely certain, of course, but it was more than most decisions were ever built on. He asked me if I was willing to stake my reputation on this assessment. I told him I was. The firm, to my quiet amazement, made the acquisition, following my recommendations almost exactly. I was given a small team and significant responsibility, far more than I had ever held before. The weight of it was immense, overwhelming, yet it settled onto my shoulders like something I had been waiting my entire life to carry. The next 18 months were the hardest and, simultaneously, the most exhilarating of my entire career. I worked constantly, not because anyone demanded it, but because the work demanded it. Because every single decision carried real, palpable consequences, and I utterly refused to make those decisions carelessly. I learned to manage people, to communicate clearly and decisively, to make impossible choices under crushing pressure, and to defend those choices fiercely when they were inevitably questioned. The portfolio recovered, not spectacularly, not in a way that made splashy headlines, but steadily, reliably. Each quarter, a little better than the projections. Each problem a little more manageable than expected. By the time we sold the last of the assets, the firm had made a substantial profit on an investment everyone else had dismissed. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't seek credit or recognition. I simply noted the quiet success, filed away the invaluable lessons I had learned, and immediately began looking for the next opportunity. My reputation within the industry began to subtly shift. I was no longer just competent. I was someone who saw what others missed. Someone who could find genuine value where others saw only intractable risk. Invitations to conferences started arriving. Requests for interviews. Even offers from competitors who had heard about the distressed asset success. I began speaking at financial events, not as a performer, but as someone with genuine, hard-earned expertise to share. My style wasn't flashy, but it was undeniably effective. I spoke clearly, answered questions directly, and adamantly refused to hide behind jargon or unnecessary complexity. Audiences responded to this, to the palpable sense that I was telling them the truth rather than trying to impress them. One of those speeches led to a conversation that would, ultimately, change everything. Richard Chun was in the audience, a man I knew by reputation, a formidable name, but someone I had never actually met. He was building something new, something truly innovative, a financial institution that operated fundamentally differently from the traditional banks and stodgy investment firms. After my talk, he approached me and simply asked, "Have you ever thought about being more than just an employee?" I told him I had thought about little else for years. He smiled, and we began to talk. The conversations continued over months, careful and deliberate, each of us assessing the other with quiet intensity. Richard wasn't looking for someone to simply follow orders. He was looking for a partner, someone who could share the immense burden of building something meaningful from absolute nothing. I wasn't looking for just another job. I was looking for a profound opportunity to create something that belonged entirely to me. We found in each other exactly what we were looking for. Richard had the grand vision and the crucial capital. I had the analytical brilliance and the operational discipline. Together, we began to build. My family, of course, knew absolutely nothing of this. I had long since stopped sharing my professional life with them, partly because they never asked, and partly because their indifference had, by then, become a kind of essential protection. They couldn't dismiss what they didn't know about. They couldn't diminish what they simply couldn't see. I was 30 years old when we quietly incorporated the company that would eventually become the bank. I told no one except the few people who absolutely needed to know. The foundation was being laid, silently and carefully, for everything that would follow. There is a moment in every builder's journey when the perceived safety of working for others transforms from a protection into an unbearable prison. I reached that moment on an ordinary Tuesday, sitting in a drab conference room, listening to executives make decisions that flatly contradicted everything my meticulous analysis told me. And in that moment, I understood with chilling clarity that I would never truly be free as long as I was implementing someone else's vision. Richard and I had been planning for months, brainstorming, sketching out ideas, but planning is fundamentally not the same as doing. The vast, terrifying gap between concept and actual execution is filled with fear, with doubt, and with 1,000 practical, insidious obstacles that make most dreams wither and die in the planning stage. I had seen that gap claim other people's ambitions. I had watched talented colleagues retreat, one by one, to the perceived safety of steady paychecks and predictable, unchallenging careers. I understood why they made that choice. The unknown is terrifying, and failure isn't abstract when your very livelihood, your entire future, depends on success. But I had already survived the worst thing I could ever imagine, which was being dismissed, utterly and completely, by the very people who should have loved me most. Compared to that, business failure seemed almost manageable. At least if I failed to build something of my own, the failure would be mine, earned through my own choices, rather than imposed by someone else's crippling limitations. We started small, not because we lacked ambition, never that, but because we fiercely respected reality. The financial services industry is heavily regulated, intensely competitive, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes. We couldn't possibly compete with the established behemoths on their own terms. So, we meticulously looked for spaces where traditional players were simply too large or too slow to operate effectively. We found our niche, our sweet spot, in small business lending, serving the entrepreneurs and the struggling shop owners who were too small for the big banks to care about, but too legitimate, too deserving for predatory lenders. It wasn't glamorous work, no, but it was absolutely necessary work. And necessity, you see, creates its own unique kind of value. I handled operations and the complex risk assessment, while Richard skillfully managed relationships and capital. We complemented each other in ways that felt almost divinely designed, filling each other's gaps, fiercely challenging each other's assumptions, meticulously building something that was so much stronger, so much more resilient than either of us could have built alone. The early years were brutal, just brutal. We made mistakes, some of them incredibly costly, and learned from every single one. We lost clients we should have kept, and, frankly, kept clients we absolutely should have lost. The business nearly failed, not once, not twice, but 3 distinct times in the first 4 years. Each crisis demanding that we make choices that felt utterly impossible until we made them. But we survived. More than survived, actually, we grew. Our reputation for fair dealing and sound judgment spread rapidly through the small business community, and referrals began to compound. Each quiet success led to another opportunity. Each satisfied client led to another crucial introduction. The solid foundation we had built with such meticulous care began to support a larger and larger structure. I didn't attend family gatherings during this period. Not out of resentment, no, but out of simple, undeniable necessity. I simply didn't have the time for the performance of belonging, for the forced smiles and the vapid small talk that accomplished absolutely nothing. When my mother called to ask why I had missed Thanksgiving, I just told her, simply, that I was working. She didn't ask what I was working on, and that was fine. That was, in fact, exactly what I needed. Their continued indifference meant I could build without interference, grow without the crushing weight of their opinions. They had written me off years ago, and their dismissal had, ironically, become a priceless gift. A profound freedom to become someone they would never, ever recognize. The company grew. We expanded from small business lending into other vital services, each new offering carefully built on the robust foundation of the one before. We developed cutting-edge technology that made our processes faster and more accurate. We invested heavily in people who shared our values, built a culture that not only attracted immense talent but retained it fiercely. By my 35th year, we were no longer small. We weren't yet a major player in the entire industry, but we were significant enough to be noticed, successful enough to be studied. Financial publications began writing about us, asking how we had grown so quickly in a sector dominated by entrenched giants. I declined most interviews, preferring to let the work speak for itself. Richard, though, he insisted on one specific profile, arguing persuasively that increased visibility would help us attract better partners and more sophisticated clients. I agreed, reluctantly, and the article that resulted was thorough and, I'll admit, fair. It meticulously described our journey, our philosophy, our quiet, relentless success. It mentioned me by name and described my crucial role in building the company. I wondered, reading that article, whether anyone in my family would ever see it. I wondered if it would change anything. If recognition from complete strangers could somehow translate into recognition from the very people who had known me longest. But even as I wondered, deep down I already knew the answer. My family didn't read financial publications. They didn't follow industry news. They lived in their own insulated world where Daniel's continued failures were perpetually explained away, and my own absence was barely, if ever, noticed. An article wouldn't change that. Nothing would change that, except perhaps a direct confrontation. And direct confrontation was simply not what I wanted. What I wanted was simpler and infinitely more profound. I wanted to build something that would stand, proudly, regardless of whether they ever acknowledged it. I wanted to prove, not to them, but to myself, that their assessment of my worth had been devastatingly wrong from the very beginning. And standing there in the office we had built, looking at the incredible team we had assembled, knowing, truly knowing, what we had created together, I finally understood that I had already, profoundly succeeded. The invitation to the gala arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a quiet courier to my office in a cream-colored envelope with elegant, embossed lettering. The annual Hartford Financial Summit was exactly the kind of event I had attended many times over the years, sometimes as a speaker, sometimes as a proud sponsor, always as someone who belonged comfortably in the room. This year, though, was different. This year, the invitation came with a specific request. Would I be willing to be honored as one of the summit's distinguished leaders in innovation? The recognition came with responsibilities, of course, including a prominent seat at the gala dinner and multiple mentions in the evening's program. I agreed, because refusing would have required explanations I simply did not want to give. The summit was vitally important to our industry, and visibility at this level would immensely benefit the company. My personal discomfort, believe me, was entirely irrelevant to those cold, hard calculations. What I did not anticipate was the phone call from my mother 2 weeks later. My mother called my office directly, which was an unprecedented act of outreach from her, and asked if I had heard about the Hartford Summit. I said I had. She then casually mentioned that my father had been invited as a guest of one of his business associates, and the whole family was planning to attend. I felt the collision coming, you know? That distinct, stomach-dropping certainty, even before she finished speaking. Two worlds that had existed separately, completely divorced from each other for years, were about to intersect violently, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to prevent it. My mother then asked if I would be there too. I said I would. She said, "Oh, that's nice, that it would be good to see me, that perhaps we could all sit together." Her voice was pleasant, yes, but so incredibly distant. The voice she always used when she was performing family rather than genuinely feeling it. I didn't tell her about the honor. I didn't explain my central role in the evening's program. I simply agreed that it would be nice to see them and ended the call as quickly as politeness allowed. The weeks leading up to the gala were consumed with work, with meticulous preparations for the recognition and the significant responsibilities it entailed. I wrote remarks, approved programs, coordinated tirelessly with the event organizers. Through it all, I was acutely aware of the approaching collision, the moment when my family would walk into a room where I was definitively not the person they believed me to be. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't strategize a dramatic revelation. I simply continued doing what I had always done, focusing on the work, trusting that the truth would, eventually, emerge on its own timeline. Richard knew, of course. He had met my family once, briefly, at a conference several years earlier, and had watched with quiet, discerning fascination as they talked around me and through me, never quite acknowledging my actual presence. He had asked about it afterward, and I had told him as much as I could articulate, which wasn't much, but was enough for him to profoundly understand. He asked if I wanted him to handle the situation, to manage the recognition in a way that minimized awkwardness. I told him no. Whatever happened at the gala would happen, and I would deal with it the way I had dealt with everything else in my relationship with my family, by surviving. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional, understated, effortlessly elegant. I didn't want to make a statement with my appearance. I wanted to let my presence, my quiet, undeniable presence, speak for itself. I arrived early, as I always did for events where I had responsibilities. I greeted colleagues, spoke with organizers, and reviewed the evening's program one final time. The room filled gradually, elegantly dressed people circulating through a space meticulously designed to impress. My family arrived together. My father in a dark suit that probably cost more than his judgment was worth. My mother in something appropriately expensive. Daniel, with that casual, almost arrogant confidence of someone who truly believed he belonged everywhere. They scanned the room, looking for familiar faces, for opportunities, for whatever it was they had come to find. They didn't notice me immediately. I was standing with a group of colleagues, deeply involved in a conversation about market trends, occupying a space in the room that they wouldn't have even thought to look at. When my mother finally spotted me, she waved with the practiced enthusiasm of someone performing recognition rather than actually feeling it. I excused myself from my conversation and walked toward them. My father greeted me with a curt nod. My brother with something that might have been a fleeting smile. My mother with a kind of embrace that ended before it even truly began. They asked how I was, what I was doing there, whether I had come with someone. I answered vaguely, skillfully deflecting their questions with questions of my own. I asked about their trip, about their accommodations, about whatever my brother was supposedly working on these days. The conversation was painfully familiar, following patterns established over decades. They talked. I listened. They assumed. I allowed. The dynamic, maddeningly, hadn't changed. Even here, in a room where everything was about to change irrevocably. As we talked, I noticed people beginning to approach our group. People who specifically wanted to speak with me, who recognized me from the program or from the industry. They introduced themselves, made polite small talk, and expressed eager anticipation for the evening's honors. My family watched these interactions with something akin to utter confusion, completely unable to square what they were seeing with what they stubbornly believed they knew about me. The gala officially began, and we took our seats. My family sat together at a table near the very back, guests of someone else, included but definitely not central. I sat at the front, at a table proudly reserved for the evening's honorees. Visible, yes, but still unexplained. The program proceeded through its early segments, polite speeches and expected recognitions, slowly building toward the evening's major climactic announcements. I listened with only half my attention, the other half completely occupied by the acute awareness of my family's presence, by the rapidly approaching moment when everything would become undeniably, breathtakingly clear. Richard took the stage to introduce the final, most prestigious honor of the evening. He spoke about innovation, about leadership, about the rare qualities that profoundly distinguish the person he was about to recognize. He spoke about building something extraordinary from absolutely nothing, about unwavering perseverance and visionary insight. He didn't look at me yet. He was building towards something, meticulously creating a context for what he was about to reveal. And in that suspended, electric moment, I felt the full, immense weight of everything that had led me here. Every dismissal, every single doubt, every quiet morning of solitary work, every excruciatingly difficult decision. It had all, painstakingly, brought me to this room, to this moment, to this suspended breath before the truth finally, undeniably emerged. The ballroom was designed to communicate importance, absolute, unshakable importance. Everything about it, from the dizzying height of the ceilings to the glittering quality of the crystal chandeliers, loudly proclaimed that this was a space where truly significant things happened. The people gathered here understood this, instinctively carrying themselves with the self-awareness of those who knew they were perpetually being watched. I had been in rooms like this many times, but tonight, tonight felt utterly different. Tonight, I wasn't simply attending. I was at the very center of something about to happen, though no one at my family's table understood this yet. From my seat near the stage, I could see them clearly. My father was leaning toward the man next to him, talking with the animated, self-assured authority he always deployed in social situations. My mother was smiling at something someone had said, her practiced charm seamlessly, almost automatically activated. Daniel was looking at his phone, performing boredom with that familiar, practiced ease he had mastered. They didn't look in my direction. I was seated too far away, at a table they hadn't examined closely, among people they simply didn't know. Their deeply ingrained assumption that I was somewhere in the back of the room, as peripheral here as I had always been in their lives, remained stubbornly intact. The evening proceeded through its scheduled elements. Speeches were delivered, awards were presented, applause rose and fell in predictable, polite waves. I participated in the conversations at my table, smiled at the appropriate moments, and consumed very little of the truly excellent food. My stomach was too unsettled for eating, though not from nervousness, not anymore. It was anticipation, the body's primal recognition that something monumental was rapidly approaching. Richard caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. We had discussed this moment, what he would say and precisely how he would say it. He understood the profound, personal stakes for me, though I had tried my best to minimize them in our conversations. He was a perceptive man, and he had seen enough of my family to draw his own, unvarnished conclusions. The program moved inexorably toward its finale. The Master of Ceremonies announced the final, most prestigious recognition of the evening, the honor for distinguished leadership and innovation. Richard rose from his seat and walked to the podium with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly how to command attention. He began with general remarks about the industry, about the dramatic changes that had transformed financial services over the past decade, about the kinds of visionary leadership that had made those changes possible. His voice was calm, authoritative, carrying effortlessly through the room's excellent acoustics. I watched my family as Richard spoke. My father had stopped talking, his attention finally captured by the mention of significant industry figures. My mother had composed her face into an expression of polite, detached interest. Daniel had, at last, put away his phone. Richard began to describe the person he was honoring. He spoke about analytical brilliance, about the uncanny ability to see opportunities where others saw only overwhelming risk. He spoke about operational discipline, about building robust systems that could scale effectively without ever losing integrity. He spoke about quiet determination, about years of tireless work conducted without fanfare or self-promotion. And he spoke, most powerfully, of integrity, the foundational quality that underpins every truly successful venture. I saw my father nod approvingly at these descriptions, appreciating the qualities being honored without for a second connecting them to anyone he actually knew. Richard spoke about the company we had built together, though he did not name it yet. He described its humble origins, its incredible growth, its profound impact on the small businesses it served. He spoke about the unwavering principles that guided our decisions, about the unique culture we had meticulously created, about the phenomenal team that had made everything, truly everything, possible. My brother leaned over and said something to my mother. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could easily guess the content, wondering who this paragon was, perhaps speculating about connections that could be strategically made. Richard paused. The room was now completely, utterly attentive, everyone waiting with bated breath for the name that would finally complete the vivid, compelling picture he had been so skillfully painting. That was when my father made his joke. He leaned toward his table companion, probably intending to make a private comment, but his voice, loud and confident, carried farther than he expected in the now pin-drop quiet room. "Well," he said, a sneer twisting his lips, "let's hope this isn't another family beggar type." The people at his table, a few of them, nervously laughed, that tight, uncomfortable laughter of those who feel utterly obligated to appreciate a powerful man's crude humor. My brother, Daniel, added something about never being related to someone like that, his voice cold and casually dismissive. My mother, of course, said absolutely nothing. She just looked down at her plate, that same, familiar avoidance she had practiced so meticulously throughout my entire childhood. The words reached me clearly, cutting through the room's electric anticipation like a cold blade. I felt the familiar weight of them, that practiced dismissal that had shaped so much of my life. But this time, the weight landed differently. This time, I knew exactly what was coming next. Richard had heard it too. I saw his expression flicker, saw him process what had just happened, and then decide, in that precise instant, to continue exactly as planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice now slightly louder, imbued with an undeniable steel, "before we continue, there's something you need to understand about the person I'm honoring tonight." The room went very quiet. Even the ambient hum, the subtle rustle of 300 people, seemed to suspend itself. Richard looked directly at my family's table, then at me, then back at the assembled, spellbound crowd. "The woman I'm about to recognize has built something truly extraordinary," he continued, his voice resonating with conviction. "Through her own brilliant vision, her own relentless discipline, and her own unwavering determination. She has never sought recognition. She has never demanded acknowledgement. She has simply done the work, year after year, decision after difficult decision, until the work itself became utterly impossible to ignore." I rose from my seat and, with a quiet strength I didn't know I possessed, walked toward the stage. The movement drew every single eye in the room, including, finally, those of my family. I watched their faces as recognition, slow and painful, began to dawn, as they connected the woman walking forward with the daughter and sister they had so casually dismissed for 3 long decades. My father's expression shifted, horrifyingly, from confusion to outright disbelief. My mother's hand rose to her throat in a gesture that might have been surprise, or it might have been something else entirely, something more profound, more heartbreaking. Daniel's face went through a rapid series of emotions, too quickly to even catalog. Richard extended his hand, a gesture of unwavering support, to help me onto the stage. I took it, steadied myself, and turned to face the stunned room. "Allow me to introduce," Richard announced, his voice ringing with triumph, "the Forbes-honored founder and majority owner of this institution, my partner, my colleague, and one of the finest financial minds I have ever known. Amelia." The applause began, a slow, tentative build that quickly swelled into a roaring ovation, but I barely heard it. My entire focus was on my family's table, watching the precise moment when the story they had so carefully constructed about me collapsed into utter, irreversible irrelevance. The applause continued, a deafening wave, but time had fractured into something strange and elastic. I stood on the stage beside Richard, looking out at a room full of faces, but the only faces I truly saw were the 3 at that table near the back. The three who had spent my entire life teaching me that I was less than, smaller than, other than. My father's expression had frozen, locked into something utterly unreadable. He was a man who prided himself on his composure, on never being caught without the right word or the appropriate, controlled response. But Richard's announcement had brutally stripped that composure away, leaving behind a terrifying blankness. It might have been confusion, yes, or it might have been the terrifying beginning of understanding. My mother's hand was still pressed against her throat. She looked at me the way you might look at a stranger who has suddenly revealed themselves to be someone you once knew, someone you had long forgotten, or perhaps someone you had simply never quite noticed. There was recognition in her eyes, finally, but it was fighting a losing battle against something else, something that looked almost like grief. Daniel had recovered more quickly than either of them, his face arranging itself into an expression I knew all too well. It was the expression he wore whenever reality inconveniently contradicted his cherished assumptions, a kind of dismissive skepticism that allowed him to reject what he was seeing rather than make the unbearable effort to adjust his own understanding. I did not speak immediately. The moment was too significant to rush, too weighted with decades of silence to fill with hasty, ill-considered words. I let the applause continue, let the room's intense attention settle around me like a comforting garment. I let the undeniable truth of my presence on that stage become, for them, utterly undeniable. Richard stepped back, gracefully giving me the podium and everything it so powerfully represented. His role was finished. What happened next was entirely mine alone. I had prepared remarks, of course. I had written careful, precise words about innovation and partnership, about the importance of serving underrepresented communities, about the guiding principles that had shaped our work. But standing there, looking at my family, I understood that those carefully prepared words were utterly insufficient. I spoke instead from something deeper, something raw, something I had been carrying for 30 long years. I learned early in my life, I began, my voice steady, surprisingly steady, that worth is not always recognized by those closest to us. I learned that families can love us and still fail to truly see us, can provide for us materially, yes, while starving us in every other conceivable way. The room was absolutely silent. I was not following the expected script for an acceptance speech, and everyone, sensed that something far more personal, far more profound, was happening. I built this company, I continued, my voice gaining strength, not to prove anything to anyone, not anymore. I built it because I saw a genuine need and deeply believed I could address it. I built it because the work itself was meaningful and the challenge was worthy. I built it because I wanted to create something that was unequivocally mine, something that could not be given or taken away by the fickle opinions of others. I didn't look directly at my family's table. I didn't need to. I knew, with absolute certainty, they were hearing every single word, understanding every single implication. But I would be lying, I admitted, my voice softening slightly, if I said the dismissals of my past had no effect on me. I would be lying if I said I never wondered whether the people who should have believed in me were right, whether I was truly as insignificant as they seemed to think. The admission hung in the air, vulnerable, more honest than anything I had ever said publicly. What I learned, I continued, my voice firming, is that other people's assessments are not the truth. They are opinions, opinions shaped by their own profound limitations and biases, their own fears and failures. The truth is what you build. The truth is what you do when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when the only recognition that truly matters comes from your own quiet, undeniable knowledge that you have done something well. I paused, gathering myself for what came next. Tonight, I declared, my gaze sweeping across the room, I accept this honor with deep gratitude and with profound humility. I accept it on behalf of everyone who has ever been dismissed by those who should have supported them. Everyone who has been underestimated by those who should have recognized their immense potential. I accept it as undeniable evidence that the stories others tell about us do not, absolutely do not, have to define our lives. The applause that followed was profoundly different from before. It was deeper, more sustained, carrying an emotional weight that transcended the usual polite appreciation. People were standing now throughout the room, responding to something visceral, something deeply human they had felt in my words. I looked at my family's table for the first time since I began speaking. They were not standing. My father remained stubbornly seated, his face still locked in that unreadable, blank expression. My mother had tears in her eyes, though whether they were tears of sudden, dawning pride or tears of something else entirely I could not tell. Daniel was looking at his phone again, deliberately refusing, to engage with what was happening. I stepped away from the podium and let the evening continue. There were hands to shake, congratulations to accept, conversations that now urgently required my attention. The machinery of professional recognition demanded its due, and I gave it, moving through the room with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to perform competence, even when her heart was still deeply engaged elsewhere. Through it all, I was acutely aware of my family's presence, aware of the profound shift that had occurred in the room's power dynamics. People who had been eager to speak with my father earlier now glanced at him differently, recalculating his significance in the stark, revealing light of what they had just learned about his daughter. Colleagues who had utterly ignored my existence now sought me out, asking questions, making connections, treating me as someone who undeniably mattered. My father made no move to approach me. He remained at his table until it was socially acceptable to leave, then departed with my mother and brother without making any attempt to approach me. I watched them go, their exit utterly unremarkable. 3 people leaving an event where they had discovered they were far less significant than they had stubbornly believed. I stayed until the very end, fulfilling all my obligations as an honoree. Richard found me during a quiet moment and asked if I was all right. I told him I was, which was not entirely true but was true enough. I was processing, integrating, trying to understand what had irrevocably changed and what, beneath it all, still remained precisely the same. What had changed was external. The room now knew who I was, what I had built, the formidable position I occupied in the industry. People who had previously overlooked me could not, overlook me again. Professional recognition had been publicly, undeniably confirmed. What remained the same was internal. I was still, fundamentally, the person I had always been, the person who had meticulously built something valuable through sheer discipline and unwavering determination. The recognition did not magically make me more capable or more worthy than I had been that very morning. It simply made my existing capability visible to people who had, until that moment, chosen not to see it. I returned to my hotel room late that night and sat in the dark for a very long time, thinking about what had happened and what, inevitably, would happen next. My family would have to respond somehow. They would have to integrate this jarring, new information into their long-held understanding of who I was. They would have to somehow reconcile the daughter and sister they had so readily dismissed with the formidable founder and leader who had just been honored before their very eyes. I did not know how they would manage this profound reconciliation, whether they would bravely admit their failures or, more likely, find new, ingenious ways to explain them away. I suspected the latter, honestly. People are remarkably creative, truly, in protecting their self-image, in constructing narratives that excuse their behavior and meticulously preserve their sense of themselves as fundamentally good and reasonable. My family had spent decades building a story in which I was utterly insignificant, and one evening, stunning revelation was unlikely to demolish that deeply ingrained story entirely. The next morning, I received a text from my mother asking if we could meet for coffee before I left Hartford. I agreed, more out of curiosity than any real hope. We met at a cafe near my hotel, a neutral space where neither of us had any perceived advantage. She ordered tea. I ordered coffee. We sat across from each other like strangers, which, in many profound ways, we were. She began with apologies, which I had fully expected. She was sorry they had not known about my success. Sorry they had not been more supportive. Sorry for the years of oversight and neglect. The apologies were sincere, I truly believe, but they were also incomplete. She was sorry for the outcomes without truly reckoning with the causes. I listened, silently, without interrupting, letting her say what she needed to say. When she finally finished, I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since the gala. "What was it about me?" I asked, my voice soft but steady, that made it so easy to overlook. She looked startled by the question, utterly unprepared for its directness. She started to offer a response, then stopped, reconsidered, tried again. "You were always so capable," she said finally, her voice small. "You never seemed to need anything from us. You handled everything yourself, managed your own life, never asked for help or attention. It was easy to assume you were fine." The answer was illuminating, in ways she probably did not intend. She was describing a survival strategy, as if it were an inherent personality trait, interpreting my adaptation to their neglect as the cause of that very neglect. I had learned to manage without their support precisely because their support was simply not available, and she was now using that very adaptation to excuse their original, devastating failure. "I needed attention," I said, my voice unwavering. "I just learned not to ask for it, because asking never ever worked." She absorbed this without any visible reaction, her face maintaining the pleasant neutrality she had perfected over years of diligently avoiding conflict. I could see her processing my words, fitting them into whatever convenient framework allowed her to continue believing she had always done her best. "Your father wants to talk to you," she said, changing the subject with practiced, effortless skill. "He's struggling with all of this, but he wants to understand." I considered this offer. My father wanting to talk? That was unprecedented. A startling break from decades of unilateral communication in which he spoke, and I silently listened. Perhaps he was genuinely ready to reckon with his past behavior. Or perhaps he was simply looking for a way to reassert control over a situation that had so spectacularly escaped his management. "He can call me," I said, my gaze steady. "But I'm not going to pretend that one conversation can undo 30 years. I'm not going to make this easy for any of you." She nodded, accepting this condition, or perhaps simply acknowledging that she had at least heard it. We finished our drinks in something approaching a comfortable silence. Two women who shared blood, but little else, trying to find a new, uncertain way to occupy the same space. Before we parted, she asked if I was happy. The question surprised me with its profound simplicity, its apparent concern for something far beyond social performance. "I'm building something meaningful," I said. "I'm surrounded by people who respect my work and value my contributions. I have autonomy and purpose and the deep satisfaction of doing difficult things well. Whether that's happiness, I'm not entirely sure, but it's enough." She hugged me then. A real embrace, finally, rather than the perfunctory, polite contact we usually exchanged. I let her hold on for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the complicated, heavy weight of a mother's arms around a daughter she had only recently begun to truly see. Then I walked away, back to the life I had so meticulously built, leaving her to find her way back to the family that would now have to reconfigure itself around a truth they had ignored for far, far too long. The weeks following the gala brought changes I had anticipated, and some, surprisingly, that I had not. The anticipated changes were, of course, professional, new partnership inquiries, a deluge of speaking invitations, a flurry of media requests, the inevitable, almost overwhelming attention that always follows public recognition. I managed these through our communications team, accepting some opportunities and politely declining others, always based on strategic value rather than any personal preference. The surprising changes were, intriguingly, personal. Specifically, the almost clumsy ways my family attempted to rebuild connection after decades of deep-seated neglect. My father called, just as my mother had predicted. The conversation was incredibly awkward and halting. Two people trying, feebly, to communicate across a vast, emotional distance that had grown too large for any casual bridging. He asked about the company, about my work, about the intricate details of a life he had never, ever bothered to learn. I answered his questions with the same brevity I had always used with him, providing information without any elaboration. He did not apologize directly, of course. That was simply not his way. Instead, he expressed something that might have been admiration, mingled with something that might have been a flicker of regret. He said he had underestimated me, which was, honestly, the closest he could ever come to admitting he had been profoundly wrong. He said he wanted to do better, which was a vague promise that carried absolutely no specific commitment. I told him I appreciated the call. I did not tell him it changed anything, because it simply did not. Words spoken after 30 years of contrary action are just words. They carry no real weight against the overwhelming, accumulated evidence of ingrained behavior. Daniel called, too, which honestly surprised me even more than our father's call. He had always been so comfortable in his role as the favored child, utterly secure in his privileged position at the very center of our family's attention. The shocking revelation at the gala had brutally disrupted that security, and I could hear in his voice the profound disorientation of someone whose carefully drawn map no longer matched the stark, undeniable reality of the territory. He asked if we could meet, just the two of us, to talk. I agreed, partly because I was genuinely curious about what he would say, and partly because refusing would have required an emotional energy I preferred to spend elsewhere. We met at a quiet restaurant in Boston, neutral territory for both of us. He was already seated when I arrived, looking older than I remembered. The swaggering confidence I had always associated with him now seemed thinner, more fragile. He started by congratulating me on the recognition, which felt slightly performative, but was probably genuinely sincere. Then he began asking questions about the company, about how I had built it, about the specific decisions that had shaped its remarkable growth. His questions were intelligent, more intelligent than I had expected, and I found myself providing more detailed answers than I had ever planned. Eventually, he asked the question I had been subtly waiting for. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked, his voice quiet. I considered various responses. I could have been kind, could have softened the truth into something easier for him to hear. But Daniel had spent our entire lives benefiting from those softened truths, and I decided he deserved the unfiltered version. "Because you never asked," I said, my voice flat, unyielding. "Because every single time I try to share something, anything, about my life, you either changed the subject, or looked at your phone, or simply made it abundantly clear that my accomplishments were utterly uninteresting to you. Because I learned early that I was not important enough for your attention, and I simply stopped trying to earn something that should have been given freely." He received this without any visible defensiveness, which, again, surprised me. I had expected him to argue, to explain, to defend himself with the same tired excuses he had always used. Instead, he just sat with my words, letting them land, letting them sink in. "I was a terrible brother," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," I agreed simply. "You were. I don't know how to fix that," he admitted. "You probably can't," I responded honestly. "Some things, once broken, don't repair. The best you can do is not break them further." He nodded, accepting this blunt assessment with more grace than I had ever anticipated. Perhaps the intervening years had changed him more than I realized. Perhaps the gala had forced a reckoning he had desperately needed but had never, ever sought. We talked for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from the immense weight of our shared history to lighter, less emotionally charged topics. He told me about his current work, a consulting business that was modest, yes, but stable. He had learned, he said, that he was simply not cut out for the entrepreneurial risks he had once so foolishly attempted. He was better suited, he admitted, to supporting other people's visions than to trying to create his own. This admission represented a kind of growth, a profound self-awareness I had truly not expected from him. The Daniel I remembered would never have acknowledged his own limitations, would have meticulously reframed every failure as a grand, strategic choice. This Daniel seemed more realistic, more grounded, more painfully aware of who he actually was rather than who he had been so relentlessly told he could be. We parted with something that felt almost like warmth, though I was careful not to mistake a single good conversation for a miraculously transformed relationship. The ingrained patterns of 30 years could not, dissolve overnight. But it was a beginning. The first truly authentic exchange I could remember ever having with my brother. In the following months, I maintained contact with my family in ways I had not done before. Not frequent contact. No, not intimate contact, but undeniably more than the minimal engagement that had characterized our relationship for so many, many years. I spoke with my mother occasionally, exchanged messages with Daniel, even accepted invitations to holiday gatherings that I had previously declined without a second thought. The gatherings themselves were different now. I was no longer invisible, no longer talked around and through. My opinions were solicited, My contributions were finally, audibly acknowledged. The family dynamic had undeniably shifted, though whether this was a genuine, lasting change or merely a temporary performance remained, to me, tantalizingly unclear. I did not fully trust the transformation. Too many years of contrary evidence had made trust a difficult, almost impossible thing. But I was willing to observe, to test, to see whether their altered behavior would persist or eventually, inevitably, revert to those familiar, painful patterns. What I noticed most, though, was not their changed treatment of me, but my own profoundly changed relationship to their treatment. I no longer needed their recognition. The years of building something truly independent had freed me from that desperate need. Their acknowledgement was pleasant, yes, but not essential. Appreciated, but not required. This freedom, you see, was the most valuable thing I had gained from the entire experience. Not the company, not the public recognition, not the fleeting vindication at the gala. No, it was the freedom to define my own worth, completely independent of their assessment. The freedom to choose connection without desperation, to accept relationships without dependency. I had arrived somewhere, finally, not at triumph, not at revenge, but at a kind of profound, quiet peace that had absolutely nothing to do with their opinions, and everything, to do with my own deep, unshakable understanding of who I had become. I did not win anything that night at the gala. Winning implies a contest, a competition, and I had stopped competing with my family's expectations years before the stunning revelation that finally made my success visible to them. What happened in that ballroom was not victory. It was simply truth, finally spoken aloud, in a space where it could no longer be ignored. The months since that night have been full of the ordinary, demanding work of continuing to build. The company grows, faces new challenges, adapts, grows again. The relentless cycle of business does not pause for personal revelations, and honestly, I would not want it to. The work is what matters. It has always been what matters. The recognition was a singular, powerful moment. The work, the daily grind, the quiet persistence, that is a lifetime. I think often about what family truly means and what it should mean. I grew up believing that family was simply the people you were born to, the people who shared your blood and your name and your history. I believed that belonging to them was automatic, that their love was guaranteed, even when their attention was not. I no longer believe this. Family, I have come to understand, is not simply a matter of genetics. It is a choice, renewed constantly through intentional action. It is the people who truly see you and profoundly value you, who show up when showing up is difficult, who invest in your flourishing without expecting anything in immediate return. By this definition, my biological family had failed me for decades, while the family I built at work, the colleagues who trusted me, the partners who supported me, had succeeded beyond anything I had ever known before. This does not mean I have abandoned my parents and my brother. The connections of blood carry their own weight, their own complex obligations. I maintain those connections, participate in the rituals of family, and show up for the occasions that truly require my presence. But I no longer seek from them what they simply cannot provide. I no longer measure my worth by their acknowledgement or by their heartbreaking absence of acknowledgement. My father has not fundamentally changed. He is still, at his core, the man who used words as weapons, who distributed attention according to cold, rigid calculations I never understood, who built a precise hierarchy in our family with himself at the absolute top and me at the very bottom. The gala shook that hierarchy, yes, but it did not, ultimately, demolish it. He has found ways to incorporate my success into his own self-narrative, ways that conveniently minimize his own past failures and cleverly maximize his genetic contribution to my achievements. This is what people do, you know. This is what he has always done. My mother remains who she has always been, a woman who chose peace over justice and cannot quite understand why that choice had such immense, lasting costs. She is proud of me now, she says, and I believe her, truly. But her pride carries the indelible asterisk of its lateness, the qualification of its conditions. She is proud of me now because I have become impressive. She was not proud of me when I was simply her daughter, working hard and growing quietly, desperately seeking a recognition she simply did not think to offer. Daniel has surprised me most. The brother who dismissed me so casually at the gala has, unexpectedly, become someone more thoughtful, more humble, more profoundly aware of his own limitations. Whether this change is permanent remains to be seen, of course, but I have allowed myself to hope that the person he is becoming might, just might, be someone worth knowing. I do not regret the years of invisibility. Not anymore. They taught me things that recognition never, ever could have. They taught me fierce self-reliance, the profound understanding that my worth does not, and never will, depend on witnesses. They taught me iron discipline, the ability to work without applause, because the work itself was profoundly enough. They taught me sharp discernment, the capacity to distinguish, clearly, between people who truly see me and people who see only what they expect to see. These lessons have forged me into who I am. They have shaped the leader I have become, the decisions I make, the vibrant culture I have built in the company I helped create. I could not have learned them in a family that celebrated me. I learned them in a family that overlooked me. And that learning, painful as it was, has been its own unique, profound kind of gift. To the women listening to this story, and I know you are listening, I want to say something that I wish someone, anyone, had said to me 30 years ago. Your worth is not, absolutely not, determined by the people who fail to see it. Their blindness is not your limitation. Build anyway. Grow anyway. Become who you are meant to be, regardless of who does or does not applaud. The stage they deny you is not the only stage that exists. You can build your own stage, your own audience, your own definition of success. It is harder that way, yes. Lonelier in the beginning, more uncertain in the middle. But what you build yourself cannot be taken from you. What you earn through your own effort belongs to you in a way that inherited recognition never, ever could. I was called the family beggar by a man who did not understand that I had stopped seeking anything from him years before he made that cruel joke. I was dismissed by a brother who did not realize that his opinion had become utterly irrelevant to my sense of myself. I was overlooked by a mother who did not grasp that I had already found the recognition I needed from people who actually, genuinely, paid attention. None of them could see what was coming. None of them understood who I had truly become. Their blindness was complete, and their shock at the revelation was perfectly proportional to that blindness. But here is what I want you to understand. The lesson beneath all the other lessons of this story. I did not reveal my success to prove them wrong. I did not seek that moment at the gala to achieve revenge. The revelation happened because truth eventually emerges, because reality eventually asserts itself, because you simply cannot hide substance forever behind the flimsy veil of other people's shallow assumptions. I built something real. I became someone capable. I created value that exists completely independent of my family's acknowledgement. And when the moment came for that reality to become visible, I was not vindicated. I was simply recognized for what I had already been for years. The family beggar owns the bank now, not because she won anything, but because she built her own truth. Voice softens, perhaps a slight, knowing smile can be heard in the tone. Have you ever had to build your own path when others refused to see yours? Or confronted old narratives that no longer served you? Share your story in the comments below. I'd really love to hear what you think.